The G20 summit in India has had one or two positives and one or two negatives. The positives are to establish the historic links between India and France, for example, which means that any thawing in the relationship between India and Britain is offset by the relationship across the Channel. And the efforts by Russia, for example, to woo India are again going to be at least modified by a recognition that there is that European voice whispering in the ear of the Indian statesmen and women. And the Russia-China situation dominates the end of the G20 because it can't reach a proper condemnation of the Ukraine war without the support of China. And China is dithering. Why is China dithering? Well, on the one hand, of course, there is the Taiwan option, and is China going to attack Taiwan? I don't think China is, but it probably wants to leave open the options, and it's reading the wider scenario. And the wider scenario is very interesting. The president is at the beginning of his current term of office, which means he's got 5 years of freedom before he needs to think seriously about either stepping down or and leaving a secure country to his successor, or seeking re-election, which was effectively nodded through, but nevertheless, it requires that patina of popular support. The same thing as Putin's re-election in 2024 requires that patina of popular support. No country is going to get involved in a war that cannot be won with an election facing them. Now, China has an election some way off. Will China get involved in this Ukraine conflict? There is time for that. There is time for that. And there is time to clear up the damage afterwards. As I see it, we have choices. Should China find itself in a position where it wants to supply arms to Russia to lengthen the Russian-Ukraine war, in other words, to take the threat of any sort of nuclear activity off the table, because be in no doubt, there are various options available to Mr. Putin at the moment. Option number one is that the war continues until at least 2024, which I think is the most likely option. It continues rumbling on. Russia has the manpower to ensure that that happens, just as Ataturk had the manpower to eventually win in the Gallipoli campaign, because the West simply didn't have the soldiers necessary to withstand the huge number of Turks who were ready to die at the command of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. The same thing could be true of particularly Prigozhin, who seems to have favoured exactly that approach, just kill as many of his own soldiers as possible simply to get territory. His own soldiers, anyway, are convicts. Life is cheap. So there is the option that Putin can keep going on, at least for another year. There is also the option that if Ukraine were to have a breakthrough and seize Donbass, or much more catastrophically seize Crimea, that things take a darker turn, that if Crimea is threatened, the military solution turns into a political issue, and whether the use of tactical or general nuclear weapons is actively possible. If Putin uses tactical weapons in the Ukraine, NATO has said that it will get involved. It wouldn't necessarily be on NATO's part with a nuclear response, but it still ends up as an impasse, because if Russia was then involved in a war with NATO, Russia couldn't possibly use any further nuclear weapons without sparking a nuclear retaliation. That probably wouldn't happen. That's an endgame scenario. And so Putin must have factored this in, that even if the Crimea is threatened or even taken, a nuclear response would be a very bad and a final move. And a final move for what? To secure his next election. Because that's why this war took place in the first place. No matter what rhetoric is used, no matter how the troll farms dish out their slogans. And the troll farms, of course, are already compromised and already threatened, because Putin is trying to dissociate himself from Prigozhin, who Putin probably quite wisely thinks has got political ambitions. That wouldn't work. Prigozhin is behind the troll farms. The troll farms may die. We may lose lots of subscribers in YouTube simply because the troll farms disappear overnight or stop being funded. What we need to make sure of is that while the West is not at war with Russia, and we are not at war with Russia, we open the doors. This idea of applying sanctions, I think, in the long run might have some sort of effect, but in the short run, it has closed more doors than it's opened, and it hasn't seriously damaged the Russian economy. Therefore, Russia has continued to act as it wills. I think we should be finding ways to get round the table and to be talking to Russia. Even if we think that Putin has flirted with evil, I think he has, but I think it's also possible to bring him back. I also think that in any form of negotiated settlement, we must be thinking about the negotiations with Germany at the end of the Second World War, not at the end of the First World War. We need to forever bear in mind the book by John Maynard Keynes, The Economic Consequences of the Peace. If you haven't read that, you should do. And John Maynard Keynes is quite clear that the vindictive, spiteful agreement which was imposed on Germany at the end of the First World War effectively sows the seeds for the Second World War and builds up resentment. We need to reintegrate Russia into the international community. And that is actually precisely what Monsieur Macron is recommending. And he's right, because it's likely that in the end, the West is going to have to deal not with some other political figure, but with the current sitting president. There won't be a change of regime. So we have to find a route to retreat, and that means we have to be talking to Russia. And in the same way, should China be supplying Russia with weapons, we need to be talking to China. And the most ridiculous scenario was to call off a diplomatic meeting because of a balloon in the sky. The American balloon gate fiasco was a foolish move, We are not at war with China. We do not want to be at war with China. We do not want to be at war with Russia. All we want to do is to ensure that the sovereign integrity of Ukraine is respected and supported. That is all we want to do. And we don't want to turn Russia or any other state into an economic desert, into an outcast country. We actually want more talking, not less talking. And if that means we even have to talk to some toad like Pyotr Tolstoy, we need to get on our toad costumes and get on our lily leaf and start croaking. We must be talking. And the foolishness of not talking is demonstrated by the freeze in relations between the West and the East. The United Nations needs serious and speedy reform, just as Europe needs serious and speedy reform, particularly if it's going to, as it states, if it's going to help to pay for the enormous debt that has been ratcheted up by Ukraine over the last year. Europe is going to take on so much of that debt. And how can Europe, a country with struggling countries like a federation with struggling countries like Greece and Italy as part of it, how can this European federation, how can Europe take on such debt at this time? Certainly not on a protracted level, certainly not year after year after year. It simply isn't possible. And the only way out of this is to talk. Monsieur Macron is absolutely right. Now, the Russians may be hoping that eventually the West's support for Ukraine will fail. It may be hoping that there'll be some sort of miracle like the Finnish war, the Finnish, the Deus ex machina, the miracle that turns its war round when the Finns run out of steam. I don't think that's going to happen in Ukraine. I think President Zelensky not only is encouraging his people, but he is a manifestation of Ukraine's resolve. And there will come a point where the Russian population recognizes that in Ukraine are their grandparents, their cousins, their nephews, their nieces, their family. And I think the more likely scenario is that the public will turn against this war in Russia. But it may not be so dramatic that there's some sort of revolution. There won't be a revolution, I don't think. This is going to be a quiet and gentle murmur that in the end, President Putin is going to find very difficult to resist. And we need to provide the machinery for Putin to negotiate, even if that's not sitting down at the same table with President Zelensky. He needs to know that there are people at whose table he can sit down. Maybe this is the role that China can play. But a China that is equally being excluded from the Western alliance is not likely to be doing us many favors. We need to be talking to China. We need to be talking to Russia. Talking seems to be something we find very difficult to do at the moment. We should do more of it. Talking and maybe having tea. Somebody asked me yesterday to do a talk about the problems of a fractured society, and why having a cup of chocolate on a winter's night with other people is so valuable. Well, I wouldn't choose a cup of chocolate, but I would choose a cup of tea. And I think a cup of tea can solve a lot of problems. We don't need to agree with somebody with whom we're having a cup of tea. We just need to be talking.